What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg, he of the unintentional pork chop sideburns. I didn't mean for this to happen. Here was Ziggy, apparently, who just showed up. Good to see you, bub. And today, we're looking at some of the most overlooked and underappreciated cards in Ravnica Allegiance. That's right, it's that time again, because every spoiler season there are a bunch of cards that fly well under the radar, and it becomes my job to tell you what you're not paying enough attention to. I actually have a pretty decent track record with these. Last time I called Arclight Phoenix when everyone called that card trash. I called Vivian Reed and Corset when everyone called that card boring and stupid. I called Jade Light Ranger when everyone said it somehow wasn't enough value. I don't understand what everyone was thinking back then, but still, I usually get one bang on the head, so hopefully that'll happen again. Wish me luck. Let's go through these. Now, my honorable mention is Verity Circle. I'm not going to verify Verity Circle, but I will show some charity to the Verity, because things can go from verity to hilarity with alacrity. Woo! But let's keep it real. There are kind of a lot of check marks in the bad column for this card. You know, it doesn't do anything the turn it enters the battlefield, ostensibly at least. In most cases, it won't. It costs $1 million, kind of, effectively, to activate that ability there. And what if your opponent isn't even playing creatures in the first place, or at least that many? The card is effectively dead, you know? You don't want to take a turn off to play it. It's a bad card. In a lot of ways, but it's also a really intriguing card. It's even piqued the interest of eminent magic mathematician Frank Karsten. Wrote a whole article about this card and kind of called it a good engine. I'm not going to put too many words in his mouth, but he did use the words good and engine, so at least there's that. You know? I think that in a deck meant to abuse this card, and against specifically, you know, aggro and mid-range decks, this could do a lot of work, generate a lot of value over the course of a game, especially in combination with fun stuff that you probably wouldn't be playing otherwise, but still, you get to play like Tempest Caller or Sleep and do some really funny stuff the next turn after you play Verity Circle, so that's cool. Plus, there's like Chillbringer and Water Trap Weaver and a bunch of other stuff that allows us to, you know, tap our opponent's creatures, depose, deploy. There's some stuff. So I think that this could be, if nothing else, a fun engine, and I hope we're still talking about it a month or two from now, but just in case we're not, you get your moment in the sun. But on to the actual list here. My number 10 is Mesmerizing Benthid, and despite the illusions, I don't think I'm seeing things here. This is a good card. There's just so many things going for this card. Even at the 5-mana rate, it puts 3 bodies onto the battlefield. It makes it really difficult just immediately for your opponent to attack into your board state, and it's really difficult for them to get rid of the octopus because it has the hexproof as long as you've still got one of your 0/2 guys. And it even kind of makes Sexy Jace worth looking at again. Like, does Pretty Boy Jace actually go in a deck with this? I'm not too sure about that. And that's really the problem, is finding the deck that wants an effect like this, but there are plenty of decks that don't want to see this effect played against them, and so I think that this might actually be worth a couple of sideboard slots. And if you are looking for a main deck home for this, consider for a moment the High Alert deck. I know a lot of people are looking at Defender creatures for that deck, but think about this for a second. It effectively puts 9 power on 3 different bodies on the battlefield for just 5 mana, and by the way, 5 of that power has hexproof in that deck, so that looks pretty good to me. So don't believe people when they tell you this is a croctopus. I think this is kind of a loctopus to have some kind of effect in Standard. But on to my number 9, which is Awaken the Erstwhile. And yeah, I understand the irony of Awaken being on a sleepers list, but there's actually some cool ways to break the symmetry of this card, which I think is the secret of making it a decent card. Just in Standard, you've got the option of dropping Death Baron, and then suddenly you've got a bunch of 3/3s with Death Touch, and they've got a bunch of 2/2s, which is that your board is better in that case. So keep that in mind. There's also the fact that you might want to discard whatever you're discarding. You know, that might actually be an advantage to you in some ways, depending on what kind of deck you're building. A Reanimator deck, or just really anything that gets value out of its yard, is going to want to discard a bunch of cards. If you're playing against control, yeah, you gave them a board full of creatures, but you also made them discard their hand if you resolved this, which I kind of think means you came out on top in that exchange. And if you're looking for combos, Golden Demise, bada bing. If you have the City's Blessing, which shouldn't be too hard to get considering you had at least 5 mana when you played Awaken, and you got a bunch of zombies after you played Awaken. So if you play Golden Demise, you can just wipe your opponent's side of the battlefield, and then, look at that, you still have your zombies. So this card doesn't actually look too bad. There's some cool interactions, and there's definitely a bunch of Johnny stuff that could be done with this. Things like Golden Demise and Death Baron are just the tip of the iceberg. Those are really simple interactions, but I'm sure there's probably some dumb stuff that can be done with this further on down the line. Now, my number 8 is end-raze Forerunners, but you can call him Mr. Pig, and if you don't appreciate this card, Google the phrase casting pearls before swine, because it might apply to you. I'm going to get in all the pig jokes I can here. And needless to say, this enter the battlefield trigger really brings home the bacon in ramp decks. This is a great thing to have at the top end of your curve, provided that you're not ramping with mana dorks, you know. If you've got a bunch of Llanowar Elves, Incubation Druids, and Druid of the Cows and stuff like that you tap to play this, obviously it's not an incredible card, although the haste is pretty important. Even if you do tap a bunch of creatures to play it, it still has a lot of, you know, real import the turn that it enters the battlefield. And I actually think that if this card resolves, it's going to win you the game most of the time. So it's definitely worth taking a look at yet another fixed Craterhoof Behemoth, because those tend to be pretty good. Decimator of Provinces, another big pig with a pretty comparable enter the battlefield trigger, was sparingly played the last time it was in Standard. So I think this is worth a look too. And my number 7 is Scarhen Hellkite. I really like saying the name Scarhen Hellkite. But it's a good card. I really think it is. You know, I've seen some people just call this a Volcanic Dragon for 1 mana less, and a 4/4 vanilla creature isn't good for 5 mana. Well, those people are willfully missing the point. It's obviously not a vanilla 4/4 for 5. It also has flying and possibly haste. Or it's a 5/5 flyer. Without the haste, that can also shoot down small creatures, sometimes 2 at a time, depending on what you're up against. So I actually think this card has so much play on it, so much versatility. If you're in for a long game or you're playing against aggro, you're going to want to play it with the counter on it. It outclasses pretty much everything in their deck most of the time. And if you untap with it on the battlefield, suddenly you can just blow up most of their board, depending on how much mana you've got access to. Over a couple of turns, this is going to kill a guy or 2 or sometimes 3 and leave you with a huge body in the air, and that's unbelievable. But against control decks, when you can resolve it, you'll take a 4/4 haste as well, you know? Really depends on the situation, but there are a lot of times that you'll take either mode on this card. Here we are at number 6, ladies and gentlemen. Immolation Shaman. Now, I know this is just Harsh Mentor, but like kind of worse in some ways, but I really think it depends on the format that we'll see moving onward from here. Whether or not this card sees play, you know, the format just wasn't very good for Harsh Mentor, and it didn't really have the deck that it needed to go in. But Immolation Shaman, even though its ability, at least, the text on the card, is only half of Harsh Mentor, I still think that in the right format, this thing can pay off really, really well in aggro decks. If we do ever see a real Aristocrats deck that's just full of activated abilities and such, then this card is probably going to take big chunks out of that deck's life total, so I do think this is probably worth at least mentioning. And I like cards like this that are 2 drops, they give you a little bit of value, but they also have value in the late game. They can still do damage and stuff for you. So the card looks really, really aggressive, and even if it only does a couple of extra damage over the course of a game due to its actual ability, its printed text there, I think it's probably still worth it against certain decks. But again, it all really depends on how many different activated abilities we see that are actually playable. But that's also what lands Biomancer's Familiar on the list. Now, I actually wanted to put this guy a little bit closer to the number 1 spot because I think he's the definition of a sleeper. Just like Immolation Shaman. This is dormant. It is asleep until the right deck comes along for it to either go in or to hose in the case of Immolation Shaman. But we're looking for the right deck for this to go in, and I honestly think that it has some play in the format right now. You know, things like Growth Chamber Guardian and other adapt creatures absolutely work well with this card, but also things like Shalai, and in older formats this might be alright too, considering it allows you to play basically 8 copies of Training Grounds, and that's awesome. Training Grounds decks are fun, but if you don't draw Training Grounds, they're terrible. So this gives you more of a chance to effectively draw a Training Grounds in those decks. So it's even possibly viable in older formats too, and moving forward in Standard while it's available to play in that format, then we're just going to be looking at creatures with activated abilities just a little bit differently because this card exists. And even if you can't create a buttload of value with that first bit of text, sometimes just being able to readapt creatures over and over is great. That's good. You know, Benthic Biomancer, you get a loot pretty much every turn by tapping your familiar. So Biofam looks actually kind of dangerous to me, and bears with upside are always worth a second look in the first place, but a lot of the text on this card is really, really good, so I don't think it's going to go, you know, super far. I don't think it's going to be a super important card, but you never know, because tomorrow they could, or at least in the next set, they won't do it tomorrow, but in the next set they could print something with an outrageous activated ability that this just breaks. Here we are at number 4, which is some more bio stuff. It's Biogenic ooze this time around, and I do think that even though this card looks kind of like a worse Tindershoot Dryad at first glance, it actually creates a little bit more value than Tindershoot over the course of a game if you've got the mana to put into it, and it creates a lot more power than Tindershoot over the course of a game as well, potentially, you know. In the spoiler video, I kind of mislabeled this. I said that it brings 5 power ultimately, the turn that it enters the battlefield. It actually brings 6. I missed that it hits all oozes with a counter, which is really even better than I thought it was, and I initially judged this card as pretty good. If protected and given the amount of turns that it needs to really take over a game, it absolutely can. So, and multiple copies of it would be insane too. Keep that in mind. So just getting 2 of these out seems like it'll probably win you the game without too much effort. So I like a lot about this card if you can't tell, and I don't think it's going to be too hard to figure out the secret of the ooze. But here we are, top 3, you guys, and to start the top 3, I've got a card that's actually seeing a little bit more press this week than it's seen all during spoiler season, but I wrote the list a few days ago, so it's still here, and that's Unbreakable Formation. There are people that are showing a little bit of interest in this as we get some articles coming out, and Magic writers are kind of showing what they've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks. I have seen Unbreakable Formation mentioned a couple of times, so it's not all the way a sleeper, but I still don't think the majority of the community is taking the card as seriously as maybe you could. Initially, I judged this as just make a stand, but probably worse. But in all honesty, being able to put, you know, permanent +1/+1 bonuses on all your guys is really, really fantastic. And getting a free attack step in can sometimes be really important too. So just the sorcery speed mode on this is incredible, but occasionally it's going to save you from a Deafening Clarion on the play, or it's going to save you from a Kaya's Wrath or something like that. You know, there's a bunch of sweepers that this could potentially do a lot of work against at instant speed, and aggro decks want that. They want a card that can both save them from a sweeper, but also be this huge aggressive bonus for them occasionally. So both modes on this card are really desirable in aggro decks, and mostly because of that versatility factor, I would not be shocked if it ended up seeing a couple of copies worth of play in, you know, Boros and, again, other aggro decks. Also, I couldn't decide whether to make a Kimmy Schmidt joke for the first half of this name or a Beyonce joke because of the second half of this name, so I'm just going to split the difference and tell you about the jokes rather than actually take the time writing them. That's YouTube, but anyway, number 2 is Wall of Lost Thoughts. Yeah, I'm taking this card that seriously. I think this just has a lot of play for a couple of different reasons. You know, it obviously helps the mono blue mill deck, which was maybe my favorite deck of this past season. I loved mono blue mill so much, and it was probably the deck that I got the most comments about. You know, people hit me up on Twitter and through email, patrons and stuff, letting me know that that deck was really, really fun. They love playing at F&M and on Arena and stuff, and this fits right in there perfectly. You know, that deck needs something like this. It allows you to advance your mill plan and mill them on turn 2 while still putting a really solid blocking body on the battlefield on turn 2 that's going to soak up a lot of damage from faster decks. You know, it used to be in that deck, you just go Drown Secrets on turn 2, Psychic Corrosion on turn 3, and you're taking all of the damage in the world in the meanwhile from fast aggro decks. And that can be a real beating, but now, if we miss Drown Secrets, or if we want to play a little bit out of sequence against an aggro deck, we can drop this turn 2, and that really helps cover us to play Psychic Corrosion on turn 3 without taking all of the damage, because we have a fat blocker out. So I really like the implications just in the mill decks for this card, but that's the obvious. The less obvious is the fact that this is just target player, so you can hit yourself and put the top 4 of your library into your graveyard, which is really important. I shouldn't have to tell you, for a variety of decks, Reanimator decks, Surveil decks that might want to do that, you know, anything that wants to get value out of its graveyard, Blood Operative decks and stuff like that, Narcomoeba, Creeping Chill. There is all kinds of stuff in this format that interacts well with this card when you just target yourself. And again, you're, you know, not necessarily giving up board state in order to have that effect. You still get a nice blocker that carries you through the early game. So I love this card, and I had a joke written for it, but I somehow lost it. Oh wait, that was the joke. But anyway, we're here at number 1 finally, you guys. What could it possibly be? It's actually Ethereal Absolution. Do I think this card is ethereal? Absolutely. Now this costs 6 mana. It does. But at the same time, it's board control and a win condition all at the same time. Man, that's a good card. That's a good card, even for 6 mana. A control deck doesn't even have to play any creatures, really. They can just use this as a way to fill the skies in the late game and still shrink their opponent's board, which is really cool. If nothing else, it's a sideboard option against tokens decks, afterlife decks, and stuff like that. And it plays well in afterlife decks, obviously. You know, again, shrinks your opponent's board while giving you 2/2s every time you get an afterlife dude. So that is just yes to every single bit of it. I know that 6 mana is an awful lot, but the Immortal Sun sees a little bit of play here and there right now. And even though they are different cards, I think this has just as much play and advantage for a control deck as Immortal Sun does, or a mid-range deck that often plays Immortal Sun in the sideboard. Maybe you see a one-of in the main deck in mid-range. This, I think, will, in some cases, take the place of Immortal Sun, especially after Sun rotates. This is a shoe-in to take its place. Again, it doesn't do all the things that Sun does. It doesn't draw you cards, which kind of sucks, but it does allow you to sort of create at least on-board advantage with that activated ability. And again, shrinking your opponent's whole team is always better than it looks. But, ba-deep, that's all I got to say for this one, you guys. Let me know how you felt about these analyses in the comments section down there. Anything I missed might actually show up in the next video, which is going to be the Ravnica Allegiance Top X. It's going to be a lot, I think. I want to do a lot. Usually I do top 5 commons, top 5 uncommons. Here are my top 25 rares and mythics. I think I'm just going to incorporate all the things into one list and make this one big list this season, so join us for that in a couple of days. Make sure you're subbed, hit the bell for the notifications too. And then Deck Tech season a couple of days after that, so a lot to get hyped for. Make sure, by the way, before I get out of here, I got to tell you, we're doing a thing on Patreon right now. We're actually always doing this, but it's important to tell you about it at this point specifically. But if you throw $1 into Patreon, a link in the description, by the way, then you can help determine and vote for what decks we actually end up doing at the beginning of the season, and pretty much all the way through the season, for that matter. We end up doing polls for what decks you want to see next. So you can kind of help determine what I do around here, which is a pretty important job and affects the course of YouTube history. So throw $1 in the Patreon pot if you got it right now. Link in the description for that. Help vote on what decks you want to see first. But aside from that, just pre-order any of this stuff over there at the TCG Player. That's the first link in the description. They help sponsor my stuff. They're good people, so I make sure I put their link first. If you want to pre-order any of this stuff at the prices that you may have seen here, then go ahead and do that. Click the link in the description. And even sealed product like booster boxes and stuff are under MSRP. So help your boy out. Click the link in the description. Go over to TCG Player. But aside from that, I think my job here is done. Go ahead and hit me as hard as you can in the comments section on some of these, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Make sure you spread love and be kind.